The Cygnans arrived not in thunder, but in light, their ships descending through the atmosphere like captured stars falling in slow motion. They were vessels of pure, crystalline geometry, humming with a soft, benevolent energy that calmed the very air around them. There was no invasion, no ultimatum, only an offer, broadcast on every channel in every language. "We are the Cygnans," the voice said, a melodic chorus that felt more like music than speech. "We have watched your beautiful and chaotic world struggle. We have seen your potential, and we have seen your pain. Allow us to help humanity, weary from its self-inflicted wounds of climate catastrophe, endless wars, and social fragmentation, wept with relief. We opened our arms, and they embraced us. The first few years were a blur of miracles, a golden age gifted from the heavens. They gave us fusion energy that was clean and limitless, turning our deserts green and healing our poisoned skies. Their medical nanotechnology rewrote the rules of disease, curing cancer, Alzheimer's, and extending human life by decades. They didn't ask for tribute or territory. Their only request was for mutual understanding, a cultural exchange to enrich both our civilizations. Dr. Eris Thorne was at the very heart of that exchange. As a xenolinguist, he was one of the first humans to truly communicate with them, to look past the ethereal, 7-foot-tall beings of light and sinew and into their philosophy. He spent his days with Lyra, the Cygnan emissary to Earth. Her form, a graceful dance of pearlescent light, contained within a vaguely humanoid shape. He found their history fascinating, a saga spanning millennia where they had encountered countless worlds and, by their telling, had helped them all achieve harmony. Eris became their most passionate advocate, arguing in global forums that this was not a surrender of human identity, but its glorious next chapter. He truly believed they were our saviors. The change was so gradual that at first, Eris himself celebrated it as a sign of success. The constant, grating noise of human conflict began to fade. Nations that had been enemies for centuries dismantled their borders. The frantic, desperate pursuit of wealth and power was replaced by a calm sense of community. But the quiet that followed was not the peaceful silence of contentment. It was the hollow silence of an empty room. Eris first noticed it in the art. New music began to sound alike, elegant and structured, but lacking the raw, messy passion that defined human creation. Paintings became technically perfect, but emotionally sterile. Literature lost its bite. Its exploration of the jagged edges of the human condition smoothed over into bland parables of cooperation. He called it the whisper, a term he entered into his private logs. It was a gentle, pervasive suggestion, a cultural current that was slowly eroding the very things that made humanity unique: our irrationality, our stubborn defiance, our capacity for both transcendent love and terrible hate. The Cygnans were not conquering humanity. They were sanding us down, polishing us into a perfect, featureless sphere. People were happier. It was true, but it was the placid, unthinking happiness of a well-cared-for pet. The fire was going out, and most people were simply warming their hands, grateful for the lack of smoke. His concerns were dismissed by his peers as romantic nostalgia for a chaotic past. "Eris, we have peace," his colleagues would say. Isn't that what we always wanted? But Eris had seen the Cygnan archives, or at least the public-facing versions. He remembered Lyra's words, spoken in her lilting, hypnotic cadence, Chaos is a symptom of a species in pain. We provide the cure. The word cure began to haunt his dreams. It sounded less like medicine and more like an extermination. He began to search for help, for anyone else who felt the unnerving chill beneath the warmth of this new utopia. He found her in the most unlikely of places, the decommissioned remnants of the Global Military Command. General Eva Rostova was a relic, a hawk from a bygone era of paranoia and suspicion. She had been forcibly retired after vocally opposing the open integration with the Cygnans, and now lived in quiet obscurity. When Eris finally secured a clandestine meeting, he found a woman whose eyes still held the cold fire he realized he hadn't seen in another human for years. "You're finally seeing the bars of the cage. Doctor," she said, her voice a low gravel, untouched by the melodic placidity that had crept into modern speech. "It's a beautiful cage, I'll grant you that. But it's a cage all the same." Rostova hadn't been idle in her retirement, using old-world contacts and back-channel spycraft that the Cygnans, in their sophisticated arrogance, had deemed obsolete. She had been digging. "They're not conquerors. Thorn," she explained, her face illuminated by the flickering glow of an encrypted terminal in her basement study. "They're curators. They collect civilizations. They find species like ours. Loud, messy, and brilliant. And they prune them." She brought up a decrypted Cygnan file, a star map showing dozens of worlds, each labeled with Cygnan script. "I had this translated. It doesn't say allies or partners. It says assets. They pacify a species, dull its creative and rebellious instincts, and then integrate its collective consciousness into their own. We're not being uplifted. We're being assimilated into a cosmic choir, forced to sing a song we didn't write. The whisper wasn't a side effect. It was the weapon, a slow-acting psychic poison that made you gratefully accept the death of your own soul." Rostova then revealed the true reason for her unwavering suspicion, a secret so profound it had been kept even from men like Eris. "Decades before the light show started, we found something," she said, her voice dropping lower. "Out in the Kuiper Belt. An anomaly. Not a ship. Not a satellite. The team that found it called it the Heart. It was an artifact, a biomechanical seed of unknown origin, dormant and impossibly complex. It seemed to be part organic, part machine, and part something else entirely. Something that defied physics as humanity understood it. Fearing it could be a weapon or a plague, the world's pre-Cygnan powers secretly formed a joint task force to study it, burying it in the most inaccessible place on the planet, a geothermal vent on the floor of the Mariana Trench, housed within a deep-sea facility codenamed Hades Base. The project was called Chimera. For 30 years, they had made almost no progress. The Heart didn't respond to any tool or probe. It communicated in flashes of quantum entanglement and what the project's biologists could only describe as genetic poetry. It wasn't offering technology. It was offering a metamorphosis, a change to humanity's very blueprint. "The lead scientists warned us," Rostova said grimly. "They said trying to force an activation would be like a child trying to rewire a star. They called the process uncontrolled genesis. The Cygnans, with their advanced senses, had been aware of Earth for some time, but they only made contact a year after Project Chimera began. They're not here because we were destroying ourselves," Rostova declared, her fist clenching. "They're here because we found this. The heart represents the one thing they cannot control: true, unpredictable change. It is an imperfection in their grand design, a variable they need to eliminate. Her words hung in the air, heavy and cold. The Cygnan's arrival was not an act of charity. It was a preemptive strike, the most patient and insidious one in history. The final piece fell into place with a chilling chime from Rostova's terminal, an alert from a deep-sea sensor network she still secretly controlled. "They're moving," she whispered, her face going pale. A squadron of crystalline vessels just broke formation from their orbital patrol. Their destination, the Mariana Trench. The Cygnans knew. Their benevolent mask was about to come off. They weren't going to ask for the heart. They were going to correct the problem with surgical, silent precision, erasing Hades Base and Project Chimera from existence. And with it, humanity's last, unknown hope. There was no time for debate, no time to appeal to a world drunk on peaceful apathy. The choice was brutal and immediate. Unleash a potential apocalypse in the desperate hope of preserving the human spirit, or allow that spirit to be silently smothered in its sleep. An hour later, Eris Thorne, the linguist who had once built bridges to the stars, was strapped into the co-pilot seat of a military-grade submersible, the Styx, plummeting into the crushing blackness of the trench. Rostova was at the helm, her knuckles white as she navigated the treacherous descent. The scientist said the activation sequence requires a biosignature authorization from both a scientific and a command-level officer, Rostova said, her eyes fixed on the sonar display. A failsafe, to ensure the decision was made by both the people who understood it and the people who had to live with its consequences. Aris looked at the small, glowing console between their seats. The interface for the heart's activation. His handprint was the final key. He was the scientist. Rostova was the command. On the sonar, a cluster of new contacts appeared above them, descending with impossible speed and silence. They were geometric, elegant, and utterly terrifying. "They're here." "Doctor," Rostova said, her voice steady as steel. "They're powering their energy systems. It's now or never." Aris stared at the console, his heart hammering against his ribs. He remembered Lyra's voice. As beautiful as a funeral dirge, it is better to be a perfect echo than a flawed voice. He raised his trembling hand, the faint glow of the screen illuminating the terror and resolve in his eyes. He had once welcomed the alien song. Now, he would choose to unleash a scream. The console wasn't a screen, it was a membrane. As Aris pressed his palm against the cool, yielding surface, it felt less like activating a machine and more like touching a living thing. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. The hum of the Styx's life support and the distant groan of the trench's pressure were the only sounds. Then, a low thrum vibrated through the hull, a resonance that started in his bones and spread outward. The light from the heart's containment chamber shifted from a dormant, patient blue to a brilliant, furious crimson. It wasn't an explosion. It was an inhalation, a cosmic gasp. From the core of the heart, a wave of pure information, of raw, untranslatable data, pulsed outward. It wasn't energy or radiation. It was something far more fundamental. It was a signal aimed not at technology, but at biology. On the sonar, the descending Cygnan vessels, previously moving with the fluid grace of sharks, suddenly faltered. Their perfect crystalline forms flickered as if struggling to hold their shape against a current they couldn't perceive. It's done. Aris breathed, pulling his hand back as if burned. The console now swirled with a kaleidoscope of colors that seemed to mirror his own frantic heartbeat. Get us out of here. General Rostova didn't need to be told twice. She slammed her hands on the controls, and the sticks lurched, its powerful thrusters blasting silt and rock from the sea floor. The Cygnan response was immediate and merciless. Beams of coherent light, silent and impossibly precise, lanced through the darkness, not exploding but unmaking whatever they touched. A section of Hades' base to their left simply ceased to be, the water rushing into the vacuum with a deafening implosion. Rostova piloted the sub with a savage grace Aris never would have imagined, weaving through the collapsing architecture of the base as Cygnan beams erased entire corridors behind them. The heart's pulse intensified, and the very water around them seemed to change. Phantasmal, bioluminescent shapes, like ghost leviathans made of pure emotion, swirled in the abyss, drawn to the heart's call. One of the Cygnan vessels was caught in the path of a particularly dense wave of the heart's output. Its crystalline structure warped, the light within it turning a sickly, chaotic yellow before the entire ship dissolved into a shower of inert, glittering dust. The remaining Cygnan ships broke off their attack, reorienting themselves not in pursuit, but in a defensive formation, as if facing a threat that dwarfed a mere human submersible. They were no longer hunters. They were wardens scrambling to contain a breach. As the sticks ascended from the crushing dark, Aris watched the depth gauge unwind, each meter feeling like a year. He wasn't just rising through water, he was rising into a new world, one he had irrevocably broken. They breached the surface under a sky that felt different, charged with a strange, new electricity. The placid blue was gone, replaced by a riot of bruised purples and fiery oranges, the clouds churning with a passion the atmosphere hadn't known in years. Rostova steered them toward a remote, uninhabited island in the Philippine Sea, a prearranged extraction point for one of her ghost networks. As they emerged from the sub, the air itself felt alive. The wind didn't just blow, it howled. The waves didn't just lap at the shore, they crashed with a furious, primal energy. "They're not following," Rostova said, scanning the horizon with military-grade binoculars. "They're holding a perimeter around the trench. They're trying to quarantine it." Aris barely heard her. He was staring at his own hands, which were trembling. It wasn't from fear or cold. It was from a sensation he hadn't truly felt in a decade, unadulterated rage. It was a boiling, pointless fury at the Cygnans for their deception, at humanity for its weakness, and, most of all, at himself for having been their most eloquent apologist. Beside him, Rostova let out a short, choked sound. He turned to see the stoic general with tears streaming down her face. She wasn't sobbing. She was just weeping. A silent, steady flow of grief for the comrade she'd lost, the world she'd failed to protect, the years she'd spent in forced silence. The whisper was gone. In its place was a tidal wave. They made contact with Rostova's network an hour later via a rugged, old-world satellite phone. The voice on the other end, belonging to a former intelligence analyst named Jax, was frantic. The calm cadence of the Cygnan era shattered. "General, all hell is breaking loose, all over the globe. I don't know what it is. It's like everyone woke up." He sent them a live feed, and Aris and Rostova watched in horrified awe. In Paris, a symphony orchestra, in the middle of a perfectly structured Cygnan-inspired composition, suddenly broke ranks. The violinist began playing a wild, screeching lament. The percussionist hammered out a frantic, warlike rhythm, and the conductor, tears in his eyes, simply dropped his baton and began to sing a raw, forgotten folk song from his childhood. In Rio de Janeiro, the streets, once orderly and quiet, were now filled with 1 million people dancing, crying, and fighting. The entire city erupting into a spontaneous, chaotic festival of pure, unfiltered life. An artist in Shanghai, known for his sterile, photorealistic paintings, was shown on camera, smearing vibrant, angry colors onto a canvas with his bare hands. The pacified, gentle soul of humanity had been ripped open, exposing the roaring, beautiful, terrifying furnace beneath. The backlash was as immediate as the awakening. Decades of suppressed resentment, ambition, and hatred erupted. Old grudges, smoothed over by the whisper, now flared into open conflict. There were reports of riots in Moscow, border skirmishes reigniting in Kashmir, and corporate rivals in New York settling disputes not with polite negotiation, but with brutal, physical violence. Humanity had been handed back its soul, and it was immediately trying to tear itself apart with it. Aris felt a profound sickness. He had traded a gilded cage for a Hobbesian jungle. "This isn't freedom, Ava," he whispered, watching footage of a mob tearing down a Cygnan harmony spire. "This is a meltdown." Rostov's face was hard, but her eyes held a new light, a grim determination he hadn't seen before. "Freedom is never safe, Doctor. We were dying in our sleep. At least now we have the chance to die on our feet. We can guide this. We can shape it." Her words were cut short as every screen, every feed, was suddenly overridden. It was Lyra. But the emissary of light and grace was gone. Her form was still a shimmering dance of pearlescent light, but it was now sharper, colder. The musical voice was gone, replaced by a tone of absolute, chilling authority that resonated with the force of a command. "People of Earth," she began, her image broadcast into every home, onto every public screen, into every mind. "You have been infected. A sickness of chaos and violence, long dormant, has been maliciously reawakened by the saboteurs, Aris Thorn and Eva Rostova." Behind her, images of the riots and violence flashed, expertly edited to show only the worst of humanity's resurgence. "We came to you in peace, to guide you away from the pain of your own nature. That guidance is now over. For your own safety, for the preservation of the harmony you had achieved, we will now assume direct administration of this world. We are deploying our custodians to restore order. Any resistance will be met as a threat to planetary stability. Comply and be healed. Resist and be corrected." As she finished speaking, the crystalline ships in orbit began to move, but they weren't deploying weapons. They were deploying legions of beings, humanoid constructs of solid light and energy, descending into every major city. The custodians. They were not an army of invasion. They were an army of occupation. Aris and Rostova watched the broadcast from the rugged shore of their island sanctuary, the setting sun painting the chaotic sky in hues of blood and gold. The Cygnans had shed their disguise. The shepherds were now revealing themselves to be wolves, and they had just branded Aris and Rostova, the architects of the world's new plague. They were no longer soldiers or academics. They were fugitives, hunted by a godlike alien race, and responsible for unleashing a storm of raw human emotion that could just as easily destroy the world as save it. Jax's voice crackled back over the satellite phone, laced with a new kind of fear. "They're on every street corner. General, they're not killing people. They're pacifying them." A touch, a flash of light, and the fire just goes out of their eyes. They're putting the whisper back, one person at a time, by force. The choice had been made in the deep. The consequences were now playing out on the surface. Aris looked at Rostova, the weight of 1,000,000,000 reawakened, screaming souls on his shoulders. He had wanted humanity to have a voice again. Now he had to teach it to do more than just scream. He had to teach it to fight. The war for the soul of humanity had just begun, and its opening battle would be fought not on a battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of a species that had just remembered how to feel everything, all at once. The journey from the island was a descent into the beautiful, terrifying heart of their new world. Rostova's contact, a grizzled former naval captain named Kenji, extracted them in a battered hydrofoil, a relic of a fossil-fueled past that was thankfully invisible to Cygnan energy sensors. They sped across the churning sea under a sky that felt like a bruised, weeping wound, the water itself seeming to recoil from the light of the custodians now descending upon the continents. Kenji, a man who hadn't shown an ounce of raw emotion in the 15 years Rostova had known him, had the biggest, most foolish grin plastered on his face. "Can you feel it?" "General," he shouted over the roar of the engines. "The air, it tastes like freedom and gunpowder again." His joy was a stark and unsettling counterpoint to the horror Eris felt as Jax patched through audio feeds from the mainland. He heard the screams, the defiant songs, the sudden, chilling silences as the custodians did their work. He heard a father in Madrid sobbing with rage as he tried to reawaken his placid, smiling son, who had been corrected for throwing a rock. This was the freedom they had unleashed, a world screaming in 1,000 different keys at once. Their destination was a ghost in the machine, a place that didn't officially exist. Deep in the Siberian taiga, nestled within a decommissioned diamond mine, was a Cold War bunker codenamed the Anvil. It was shielded by a kilometer of solid rock and powered by its own geothermal vents. A primitive but effective fortress against the Cygnan's sophisticated surveillance. Inside, they found the core of Rostova's resistance. It was a skeleton crew of outcasts and relics Jax, the paranoid intelligence analyst, his face pale and unshaven, surrounded by a chaotic nest of old-world servers. A stoic ex-Special Forces soldier named Marcus, who moved with the quiet lethality of a panther, and Dr. Lena Petrova, a brilliant but disgraced neuroscientist who had been one of the first to warn about the subtle cognitive effects of the whisper. Years before the truth was known, they were ghosts, people the New World had tried to forget, and now they were its only hope. Jax gave them the full, terrifying picture. "The custodians are adapting," he said, his fingers flying across a keyboard. "They're forming a network. They learn from every interaction. At first, they were only pacifying overt aggression. Now, they're targeting any spike in strong emotion, intense joy, profound grief, passionate creativity. They're not just stopping the violence. They're trying to put the lid back on the human soul entirely." The first glimmer of a counter-strategy came not from Rostova's military mind, but from Eris's understanding of his old friends. He spent hours poring over his old notes, his conversations with Lyra, trying to find a flaw in their perfect logic. "They prune," he muttered one night, staring at a blank wall in the bunker. "They don't destroy. They correct. They guide. They harmonize. They see chaos as a signal error, a discordant note in the symphony of the universe." Rostova, cleaning a rifle nearby, looked up. "What's your point?" Dr. Eris turned, his eyes alight with a desperate idea. Their weapon, the Whisper, was based on resonance, a gentle, pervasive frequency that lulled us into harmony. The custodians are just a mobile, targeted version of the same thing. "So how do you fight resonance?" Lena Petrova, who had been listening from the corner, spoke for the first time in hours. "With dissonance," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You introduce a signal so chaotic, so unpredictable, that the resonant wave can't lock on. You fight their perfect note with pure, unfiltered noise." The idea was abstract, almost insane, but it was all they had. While Rostova began formulating a strategy around creating localized zones of chaos, Jax brought them a new piece of the puzzle, a piece that would change the entire nature of the war. "I'm picking up anomalies," he said, pointing to a global map dotted with blinking red lights. "People the custodians can't correct. I'm calling them the Unchained." The footage he showed them was stunning. In a crowded plaza in Chicago, a young street artist was surrounded by 3 custodians. They reached for him, their hands glowing with pacifying light. But as they got close, the light flickered and died. The artist, lost in a creative trance, didn't even notice them. He continued spraying a vibrant, furious mural of a phoenix onto a wall, and the custodians simply recoiled, their forms wavering as if in pain, before retreating. In a hospital in Nairobi, a doctor was weeping over a patient she couldn't save. When a custodian tried to soothe her grief, it overloaded, its light form collapsing in on itself before dissipating completely. The doctor's grief was so profound, so pure, that it acted as a shield. "The heart didn't just reawaken us," Lena explained, her face a mask of scientific awe. "For a small percentage of the population, it seems to have unlocked something, a form of psychic or emotional output that is actively hostile to the Cygnan frequency, their passion, their pain, their creativity. It's not just a feeling anymore. It's a weapon." A new plan began to form, far bolder and more dangerous than simply hiding. They couldn't build an army to fight the Cygnans physically, but they could build a choir. They could find these unchained individuals and learn how to amplify their dissonance, turning them into psychic shields for the rest of humanity. They had to give the world a new song to sing. Their first target was a musician in New Orleans, a jazz trumpeter named Elias, whose nightly sessions in a fortified corner of the French Quarter were reportedly creating a dead zone for custodian activity within a 3-block radius. Rostova, Marcus, and Aris decided to go themselves. It was too important to delegate. Getting into the city was a nightmare. Custodian patrols glided silently through the streets, their serene presence a stark contrast to the pockets of wild, defiant life that flared up in the alleys and hidden courtyards. They moved through the shadows, Eris's heart pounding with a fear that was so intense it felt like a religious experience. This was what it meant to be alive. They found Elias playing on a makeshift stage in a bar barricaded with scrap metal and old furniture. The air around him was electric, so thick with emotion it felt like walking through water. He wasn't just playing music, he was bleeding his soul into his trumpet. He played the rage of a city drowned and reborn, the sorrow of 1,000 funerals, the defiant, inextinguishable joy of a people who refused to be quiet. Aris saw 2 custodians at the edge of the barricade, their forms flickering erratically, unable to advance into the storm of sound and feeling. As the final wailing note of Elias's song faded, Aris approached him. The musician looked at him with eyes that seemed to see not just Ares, but the entire history of his pain and hope. "Took you long enough," Elias said, his voice raspy. "I've been calling. Can't you hear it?" Aris stared, uncomprehending. "Calling who?" Elias smiled, a weary and knowing expression. "Everyone who's still awake." It was then that Aris understood. The heart's pulse hadn't been a single event. It had planted a seed, a network, a psychic connection between all the unchained. They were a hive mind of human emotion, waiting for a signal, waiting for a conductor to bring them into the same chaotic, defiant orchestra. He had been a linguist who translated the words of aliens. Now, his new purpose was clear. He had to learn the language of the human soul itself and teach it how to scream in unison. The anvil transformed from a simple bunker into the nerve center of a global psychic insurgency. Lena Petrova, working with data streams Jax managed to pull from the Unchained, began to build what she called a dissonance engine. It wasn't a machine of gears and wires, but a bioorganic interface grown from salvaged Cygnan tech and cross-wired with remnants of the heart's genetic poetry from Hades' base. Its purpose was to find the specific emotional key of each of the Unchained, the unique frequency of their pain, their joy, their rage, and weave them together. Aris became the unlikely conductor of this chaotic orchestra. He would sit for hours at the core of the engine, a pulsating, semi-sentient mass of bioluminescent cabling, and reach out with his mind. At first, it was a cacophony, 1,000 voices screaming in 1,000 different languages of feeling. He felt the raw, unyielding grief of a mother in Warsaw who had lost her child, the explosive creativity of a sculptor in Mumbai, the cold, righteous fury of a former judge in Mexico City. He was an antenna for the reawakened soul of his species, and the sheer volume of it almost broke him. He would collapse after each session, bleeding from his nose and ears, the echoes of 1 billion lives roaring in his head. But slowly, guided by Elias's musical intuition patched in from New Orleans, he began to find the rhythm in the noise. He learned to harmonize their dissonance. Their first test of the engine was a desperate defense. The Cygnans, adapting with chilling speed, had pinpointed the source of the dead zone in New Orleans. They weren't sending custodians anymore. They sent a purifier. It descended from the sky like a black star, a geometric void that absorbed light and sound. It moved through the city, and everything it passed, buildings, cars. People wasn't destroyed, but simply simplified. Matter was reduced to its base elements. Emotions were flattened into absolute zero. Existence was edited down to a state of perfect, featureless null. It was the ultimate expression of the Cygnan philosophy, the erasure of all complexity. As the purifier approached the French Quarter, Rostova knew their conventional barricades would be useless. "Aris," Now! She yelled over the comms from a command post 2 blocks away. Whatever you're going to do, do it. Hooked into the engine back at the anvil, Eris took a deep, shuddering breath and plunged into the storm. He found Elias's note a vibrant, defiant chord of sorrow and resilience. Then he found another, a sharp sound, piercing shriek of rage from a fighter named Anya in the besieged city of Kyiv. He took their 2 emotional signatures and, instead of trying to blend them, he smashed them together. He wove Anya's rage into Elias's sorrow, creating a feedback loop of furious, grieving energy. Through the engine, he broadcast this combined frequency directly at Elias. Back in New Orleans, Elias felt the surge. His eyes rolled back in his head, and when he put the trumpet to his lips, what came out was not music. It was a sound that broke physics, a wave of pure, weaponized emotion that tore through the streets. The purifier faltered. Its perfect, light-absorbing surface rippled as if struck by a physical blow. The absolute nullity it projected was being corrupted by the sheer, messy reality of human feeling. Around the city, other Unchained, connected to Eris's network, instinctively joined the chorus. A poet began reciting verses of heartbreak and defiance, her words becoming a tangible shield. A dancer spun in a desperate, joyful whirlwind, her movements bending the air around her. For a full minute, the combined dissonance of a dozen souls held the purifier at bay. It wasn't enough to destroy it, but it was enough to make it stop. The Black Star hesitated, reassessed, and then slowly, silently, withdrew. They had held the line. They had proven that the human soul, in all its chaotic glory, was not just a symptom to be cured, but a power to be reckoned with. The small victory sent a shockwave through the global resistance. The story of the Song of New Orleans spread through encrypted channels, turning the Unchained from isolated anomalies into symbols of hope. More and more of them began to connect to Eris's network, adding their unique voices to his choir. The war evolved. Rostova's forces, led by Marcus, began acting as shepherds, moving pockets of civilians into the protective auras of the Unchained during Cygnan pacification sweeps. They couldn't fight the custodians head-on, but they could use the dissonance of the Unchained as a form of psychic camouflage. The world became a patchwork of silent, placid, corrected zones and vibrant, chaotic free zones, with skirmishes fought not with bullets, but with emotions. But the Cygnans were not idle. Lyra appeared on the global broadcast again, her form now stark and severe, the soft glow replaced by a hard, judgmental light. "You cling to your pain like a holy relic," she stated, her voice devoid of any warmth. "You have mistaken your sickness for your strength. This cannot be allowed to spread. The quarantine of Earth is now absolute." In the skies above, the crystalline ships began to link together, forming a vast, shimmering net around the entire planet. They were building a cage, not to keep humanity in, but to ensure its infection could never escape to the stars. Lena Petrova, analyzing the energy patterns of the orbital net, came to a horrifying conclusion. "This isn't just a quarantine," she said, her voice trembling. "It's a resonance cage. They're going to attune the entire planetary shield to a single, overwhelming harmonic, a global whisper. They're not going to pacify us one by one anymore. They're going to put the whole world to sleep at once." The final confrontation was no longer a matter of if, but when. Their only hope was to take the fight to the enemy. Rostova unveiled her endgame, a plan so audacious it bordered on suicidal Project Icarus. During the initial chaos of the Cygnan takeover, her teams had managed to secure a single, damaged Cygnan crystalline vessel that had been brought down not by weapons, but by a flock of birds flying into its path during a storm, a freak accident of pure, unpredictable nature. They had hidden it in a massive cavern beneath the anvil. For months, Lena's science teams had been trying to understand its systems. With little success, it didn't respond to their technology. "It's not a machine," Lena explained. "It's a symbiotic life form. It needs a pilot attuned to its frequency." Their plan was to use Eris and the dissonance engine not as a broadcast weapon, but as a key. He would use the combined emotional energy of the entire Unchained network to hotwire the Cygnan ship, fly it to the heart of the orbital resonance cage, and use the engine to unleash a single, overwhelming blast of pure chaos, a dissonance bomb, that would either shatter the cage or tear their own ship apart in the process. It was a one-way trip. As they prepared, a new, unexpected voice echoed through Eris's mind. It was quiet, ancient, and felt not of human emotion, but of deep, geological time. It was the heart, speaking to him from the bottom of the sea. "The cage is not the true threat," it seemed to say, in a language of pure concept. "It is a symptom. The gardener prunes the flower that grows in the wrong direction. Show the gardener a new direction." Eris realized the truth. The Cygnans weren't evil. They were gardeners, ancient, powerful, and utterly convinced of their own righteousness. They saw humanity as a beautiful but flawed plant, and they were simply trying to prune its chaotic branches to make it fit into their perfect, orderly garden. Destroying the cage wouldn't convince them they were wrong. It would only prove they hadn't pruned hard enough. He had to do more than just scream. He had to show them a new song, a new way for a flower to grow. He had to show them the beauty in the weeds. He now knew what he had to do. The mission was no longer about destruction. It was about communication. The most important translation of his life. 10 years after the Cygnan departure, the sky was no longer silent. The chorus, the vast crystalline net left in orbit, sang the ceaseless, complex song of humanity to the void. It was a symphony of 7 billion souls. A broadcast of every birth, every death, every quiet moment of despair, and every explosive shout of joy. On Earth, this constant psychic resonance had reshaped society. It wasn't a utopia. Old arguments over resources and borders still flickered, but the shared memory of the whisper and the visceral awareness of their collective emotional state acted as a governor. Humanity had looked into the abyss of its own soul and, instead of falling, had learned to navigate by the light of its own internal stars. In the rebuilt city of Detroit, a young woman named Kaylin stood before a shimmering steel wall, her hands tracing patterns in the air. She was one of the chorus-born, a generation that had grown up knowing nothing but the unfiltered emotional honesty of the new world. An unchained artist. She didn't use paint or clay. She sculpted with emotion, pulling threads of feeling from the chorus, the lingering pride of the city's industrial past, the stubborn resilience of its people, and weaving them into tangible, visible forms that shimmered in the air like heat haze. Her art was beautiful, chaotic, and profoundly alive, a perfect expression of the world Eris and Rostova had fought to save. It was Kaylin who first felt the change. During a deep creative trance, as she wove a sculpture of communal hope, a new note entered the symphony. It wasn't Cygnan. There was no judgment, no intent to correct or harmonize. It was a chord of immense, ancient loneliness, a vast and patient curiosity that felt like the quiet of deep space given voice. The chorus, which had only ever broadcasted outward, was now engaged in a duet. The signal was subtle at first, a ghost in the machine, a question mark at the end of a familiar melody. But Eris Thorn, living in a quiet monastery in the Himalayas where he helped train new Unchained to navigate their abilities, felt it like a physical blow. This new presence was not a gardener come to prune. It was something else entirely. It did not think in terms of order or chaos. It was an immense, empathetic void, and it was listening with an intensity that chilled him to the bone. He called an emergency council, a meeting of the old guard. Ava Rostova, now gray-haired but with eyes as sharp as ever, arrived from her remote cabin, her face etched with a familiar, weary skepticism. Dr. Lena Petrova, now the director of the Global Ethelred Institute for Xenostudies, patched in from her lab in Geneva, her expression one of ravenous scientific curiosity. "It's not aggressive," Eris explained to them, his voice strained. "It feels hollow, like a collector standing in an empty room, who has just heard a sound from the room next door." The new presence, which Lena's team began calling the Weavers, due to the way their signal intertwined with the chorus's broadcast, did not remain passive for long. Its curiosity turned to interaction. The effect was not a psychic push like the whisper, but a pull. Across the planet, people began to experience what became known as the echoes. In a bustling Tokyo subway car, every passenger simultaneously experienced a fleeting, visceral memory of the first Cherry Blossom Festival after the Second World War, the same crisp air, the same scent of blossoms, the same shared, unspoken relief of a nation stepping back into the light. In a field in rural France, a family of farmers suddenly felt the terror and adrenaline of a soldier storming the beaches of Normandy 75 years prior, the taste of salt and fear sharp in their mouths. The Weavers were not broadcasting their own message. They were reaching into humanity's collective unconscious, into the very fabric of the chorus, and amplifying moments of peak emotional resonance. They were reading humanity's history, not from a book, but by forcing humanity to relive it. The phenomenon was profoundly divisive. A new global movement, the Connectors, saw it as the next stage of enlightenment. They embraced the echoes, arguing that true empathy could only be achieved by literally walking in another's shoes, by feeling the shared joy and trauma that bound the species together. Kaylin became an icon for their cause, her art now incorporating the echoes, creating breathtaking sculptures of shared historical moments that allowed thousands to experience them at once. But an equally fervent faction, the Separatists, decried it as the ultimate violation. They saw the Weavers as psychic vampires, feeding on their most sacred and painful memories. They argued that the soul was private, that memories were earned, not to be sampled by some cosmic voyeur. They began to research ways to create personal shields, to cut themselves off from the chorus, risking a return to the lonely isolation of the past to preserve the sanctity of the self. "This is a weapon," Rostova stated flatly, pacing the floor of the anvil, which had been maintained as a strategic fallback. "They're mapping our psyche, finding our strengths, our weaknesses, An army doesn't invade a fortress without first studying the blueprints. This is no different. Lena shook her head, her eyes gleaming with data. The patterns don't suggest a strategic analysis. Ava, it's not targeted. They're drawn to moments of extreme emotional consensus, great tragedies, great triumphs. It's more like they're tasting a wine cellar, sampling the most potent vintages. There's no malice, only an overwhelming, perhaps even naive curiosity. Eris, looking older and more tired than ever, stood between them. It's communication, he insisted. They don't have a voice, so they're using ours. They're trying to understand what we are by feeling what we have been. They're showing us our own reflection to ask, is this you? His theory was put to the test a week later when the Weavers finally sent a message of their own. It came not as an echo of the past, but as an offering for a single, unbroken minute. Every human mind connected to the chorus was filled with a vision. It was not a human memory. It was the sensation of witnessing a star being born from a cloud of interstellar dust, not as an observer, but as the dust itself. They felt the slow, patient pull of gravity over 1 billion years, the first flicker of fusion in the core, the final, glorious exhalation of light and heat. It was a memory of immense scale and profound, non-human consciousness. And woven within it was a clear, simple concept, an invitation. The Weavers were a species of cosmic nomads, beings of pure consciousness who had long ago shed their physical forms. They roamed the empty spaces between galaxies, their existence a slow, patient observation of the universe, but they had a flaw they could not create. They could only observe, remember, and experience. They had been drawn by the chorus, a signal of a species so bursting with chaotic, creative, emotional energy that it was like a bonfire in the silent darkness of their existence. Their offer, projected into Eris's mind with the full force of their shared vision, was one of symbiosis. They wanted to connect with humanity on a deeper level, to form a permanent bond, in exchange for allowing them to experience the raw, unfiltered stream of human life, the love, the hate, the art, the war, the birth, the decay. They would open their own collective consciousness to humanity. They would share the memories of 1 trillion years, the sight of galaxies colliding, the knowledge of civilizations that had risen and fallen before Earth's sun had even ignited. It was a bargain of staggering proportions, humanity's soul in exchange for the wisdom of the cosmos. The offer fractured the fragile peace of the world. The connectors hailed it as the dawn of transcendence, the moment humanity would shed its terrestrial skin and become something more, a hybrid consciousness of fleeting, passionate life and eternal, cosmic knowledge. The Separatists saw it as the ultimate act of assimilation, a spiritual death far more complete than the Cygnans had ever offered. It was the choice between being a flawed but sovereign human or becoming a small, albeit cherished, part of a god. The debate was no longer philosophical. It was the central question of the human race. Rostava stood before Eris in the Himalayan monastery, the wind-whipping prayer flags around them. "You see it, don't you?" she said, her voice low and intense. The perfect trap. The Cygnans offered to take away our pain. These things are offering to give our pain meaning. It's the same sales pitch. Eris, just with a better marketing team. They will consume us, not with force, but with our own willing participation. We will become a living library for them to browse, a zoo for them to admire. Eris looked out at the snow-capped peaks, his face a portrait of agony. And what if we say no? Ava, we stay here, on this little rock, and live out our lives until our son dies, and everything we have ever been is forgotten. They are offering us a form of immortality. Our art, our love, our suffering, it would all be preserved, remembered forever as part of something vast and eternal. It wouldn't be ours anymore, she countered, her hand resting on the hilt of a knife she still carried out of habit. A memory, once shared, is changed. An experience, once consumed, is gone. We fought for the right to be beautifully, tragically, and ephemerally ourselves. Don't trade that away for a ghost in their machine. The weight of the decision fell, as it always seemed to, on Aris. The Weavers would not force the connection. Their nature seemed to forbid it. They required a willing conduit, an alpha node to initiate the bond. They required him. Days later, Eris stood not in a monastery, but back in the heart of the anvil, before the recalibrated dissonance engine. Lena and her team had transformed it into a communications array of unimaginable sensitivity. He was to be the first. He would open a stable, two-way channel, a bridge between his mind and the Weavers, to ask the final questions, to look into the heart of their vast, lonely consciousness and decide if their offer was salvation or oblivion. The world watched. Kalen and the Connectors held vigils, their combined hope a palpable force. Rostova and the Separatists stood ready, their plans for severing the chorus and plunging humanity back into psychic isolation a desperate last resort. Eris looked at his own reflection in the dark, dormant membrane of the console. He had once opened a door to let the Cygnans in, an act of naive hope. He had then opened a door in the deep to unleash the heart, an act of desperate rebellion. Now, before him, was the third and final door. He raised his hand, the tremor in it not from fear, but from the crushing, terrifying weight of a choice that would define the future of what it meant to be human. He had to believe this act was not one of faith, but of translation, the final, most important one of his life. His fingers brushed against the cool surface, and in the infinite, silent space between worlds, a billion ancient minds turned their collective attention toward him and waited.